All right, so good evening. Thanks to those of you who are joining live, I appreciate it. And those of you who are watching the recording, I also appreciate it. Welcome to our workshop on holding government accountable. My name is Dr. Josh Franco, Assistant Professor of Political Science at Clearest College. Quite excited to be able to have this workshop series. So let's go ahead and talk about it and then look at our schedule, and then we'll get into our topic for today, which is democratic accountability. So holding government accountable is a workshop series that's focused on how individuals inside and outside of government hold it accountable to the Constitution, federal and state laws and regulations. This is a series of 16 30-minute workshops for the spring of 2022, and they're held every Wednesday from 7:30 to 8:30, or 8, excuse me. So over the past now 10 weeks, we've talked about a range of different topics: student power, the state capitol, government manuals, holding the president, holding state government accountable. And today we're going to talk about democratic accountability and how, what it is and how it's strained in times of polarization. And just as a side note, there are different news articles that I might reference or engage with. And here's a link of some credible news sources to check out, background reading or just kind of daily reading. So Politico, The Hill, Roll Call, Rough and Tumble, and San Diego Union Tribune to kind of cover us at the national level, at the state level with Rough and Tumble, and at the local level with the Tribune. So with that, let's go ahead and jump to our our topic for today, which is democratic accountability. Now, our learning objectives with this workshop are the following. First, by the end of this workshop, you should be able to explain why elections are the clearest form of democratic accountability. And then secondly, describe how democratic accountability is strained during times of polarization and division. So let's start with some definitions. What is accountability, right? Accountability is how someone who is in a position of influence, power, or prestige is held to account by the people they either are elected to represent or that they represent through their appointed position. When we think of accountability in political science, we think about it in two ways. It's either electoral accountability or non-electoral accountability. So let's go ahead and take a look at each of those. When we think of democratic accountability, we're thinking about political systems. We're thinking about elected officials. We're thinking about appointed officials. And so when we think of electoral democratic accountability, the two basic principles that we at least have in our minds in the United States is that elections are free and fair, and secondly, that elections occur at regular intervals. Now, in other parts of the world, in other countries of the world that are democratic systems, they might not have regularly scheduled elections. It might depend on the party in power and what they basically have prime ministerial systems or non-presidential systems. And they don't have like election every 4 years like we do. Here in the United States, obviously we have election every 4 years for president. So 2024 will be the next election. At the state level for governor, the elections, there'll be one this year in 2022 and then 2026 and so on. And then we also have regularly scheduled elections for our state legislature and for our federal Congress. And so the idea is that with democratic accountability and elections, that they occur at regular intervals here in the United States. And the second part of free and fair, what this means is that there isn't any intrusion by the government or by some kind of external foreign influences in our voting processes. So when we say free, that means free for people to be able to engage, meet whatever the minimum qualifications or eligibility requirements are for voting, and that they're fair is that the rules aren't tilted for one party's political benefit or another party's political benefit. Obviously, these are kind of general abstract concepts and they get operationalized or put into reality in different ways. There's a lot of conversation today here in the United States about whether an election has been free or fair. And I kind of like chuckle at this because for most of our recent times, people have viewed our electoral system and our administration of elections as kind of above board. There might be an instance here, instance there in the country where somebody felt it wasn't fair, but for the most part, we agreed in the general sense that our electoral system was democratically accountable. But what's happened in recent time, largely due to the current president's, or excuse me, the past president's claim that the election wasn't fair, this has kind of seeded some sense of doubt and some sense of concern that our elections here in the United States aren't free or fair. But arguably, the evidence is stacked against that. Our elections administration in this country is largely well-to-do and above board. But this is one type of accountability, which is electoral accountability or democratic accountability. Now, another type of accountability is non-electoral. And you might be asking, so what is this, right? Well, non-electoral accountability includes things like protesting, petitioning your government, and lobbying your government. So protesting is pretty straightforward, right? You gather with other people who are like-minded on a similar cause or issue, and you're out in front of, let's say, City Hall, or you're standing on the steps of the state capitol, or you're out in front of the US Supreme Court in Washington, D.C., and you're protesting, holding up a sign, no, for or something, or against something, and you're demonstrating with yourself and with your presence your concerns about some particular issue. Secondly, we have petitioning, right, which is where you, I, others would send a letter to our governmental officials at the local level, say city councilor or a mayor, at the state level, the governor, lieutenant governor, superintendent of public instruction, our state senator, our state assembly person, and at the federal level, so our US congressman or US senator or the president. And by petitioning them, what we're basically saying is we, I, you have a concern about a public problem or issue. This is why we think it's a problem or an issue. This is how we hope for it to be resolved. And we'd like to know where this person stands on this issue. And by petitioning, you're making your voice more heard. I think protesting is like the first level of engagement. And then once you begin to realize that it's not just about generating public awareness, which is what protesting largely does, is it gets people to pay attention, it gets the media to pay attention, it gets reported out to the public. The next step is to say, okay, how do I start to communicate in writing to the people in power about my particular views or my particular concerns? Now, the last form of non-electoral accountability is lobbying. This is where you kind of take the next step of, say you're protesting in the street one year, the second year you're writing letters to your elected officials or to appointed officials, and then in your third year, you're walking in the halls of the state capitol before a committee hearing, stating your name, your organization, whether you're pro or con on a piece of legislation, or you're in Washington, D.C., and you're walking the halls of the Rayburn building or the Longworth building or the Cannon House office building, or on the Senate side, the Senate office buildings, and looking to meet with either a congress member or senator, or in this case, largely you'll probably meet with your staff member to share your concerns, your thoughts, your ideas on particular issues that are before the Congress, or at least approaching the Congress's agenda. And so lobbying is like direct engagement, direct contact. Now you might be asking, well, what's the big difference between democratic/electoral accountability and non-electoral accountability? When it comes to democratic accountability, this is functionally about elections, right? You and I, if we're eligible to vote, we'll vote in an election, we'll cast a ballot, and on that ballot, it'll say, we're supporting this person for president, this person for governor, this person for all the statewide offices in California, this person for state legislature, this person for local county office, city office, and then special districts like water district, or say a power district or school district. That's us casting a vote, right? And we'll be one of that hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, millions of people, tens of millions of people who are getting a piece of paper, bubbling in who we support, or maybe who we're against, and putting it in a box and having it counted as a part of this broader process. When you think of non-electoral accountability, this isn't about us casting a ballot. This is about engaging in protest to generate public awareness. It's about petitioning our government in writing and communicating with them from afar. And then lobbying is like, that day-to-day work. And when you think about accountability, those four different mechanisms are available to us, right? This is in our toolkit of holding the government accountable, right? Responsible for the actions that they've taken, for the claims that they've made, whether they've been fulfilled or not, and then for any prospective actions that they're going to take as elected or appointed officials. So these are our tools for weighing in on the processes of public policy making, of lawmaking, of rulemaking, and otherwise being involved and engaged in our democratic republic that we call the United States. Now, given these two types of accountability and different mechanisms associated with it, let's turn our attention to polarization. Now, you probably have heard about we're an increasingly polarized country. And this chart here from the study on political polarization in the American public shows us the distribution of Democrats and Republicans on a 10-item scale of political values. And what we'll see here is three different panels of this data. So in 1994, in 2004, and in 2014. So what I'll do here is I'll go into presentation mode so I can draw on the slide. And what I like to show here is how things have changed over time. So I'm going to go ahead and get my blue pen here and point out that in 1994, this was the distribution of folks who identified as Democratic. And then I'll highlight in red the distribution of folks who identified as Republican. Now, what we're interested in is the overlap of these two distributions. So in order to illustrate this a little bit better, any person who is here at the end of the scale, we would call them consistently conservative. And here, if they're in the Republican bank, we would call them probably a liberal conservative. And the same would also hold true for Democratic individuals. A Democratic individual on this end of the distribution would be called consistently liberal. And then someone who's Democratic over here, we would call them probably a conservative liberal. And so you see here that we had a good chunk of Democratic individuals who identified as Democratic, and a good chunk of individuals who identified as Republican. And what we're particularly fascinated by is the overlap between these two. So I'm going to go ahead and color this in with purple, which is kind of hard to see, but it's darker space. What we see here is a good overlap between Democratic and Republican distributions. Now, what has happened a decade after that? So 1994 to 2004. Well, what we see here is that here's a distribution of Democratic, and here's the distribution of Republican. And what should be brought to your attention is that there's seems to be like the same amount of overlap, but it's narrower. So instead of having like this broad triangle that we see, this purple triangle from 1994, what we're seeing here is kind of broad, and then it narrows out pretty fast, gets really tall, and then it goes back down again. So what this would suggest to us is that there are still people who are, let's say, liberal conservatives, and there's still people who are conservative liberals, but there's not as many as there were in 1994. And then fast forwarding from 2004 to 2014, we'll take a look at the distribution one more time. And what we'll see here is, so for Republican folks, people identified Republican on the scale, we see that distribution, which kind of is now beginning to skew to the right. And then we have our Democratic distribution, which seems to be skewing to the left. And our purple mountain in the middle has gotten less and has gotten lower. So what does that mean? What this means is that if that purple mountain, the overlap is getting smaller and smaller and smaller, or smaller and narrower at the same time, that there's less people who identify, let's say, as a moderate Democrat or as a moderate Republican, or that there's less people identify as liberal conservatives or conservative liberals. And that basically means that there's less commonality politically, at least according to this 10-point item measure of political values. So this is one way of illustrating this political polarization that we're seeing in the United States, is that basically Democrats and Republicans have overlapped in 1994, but over time they're overlapping less and less and less and less. And in that process, there's not a lot of commonality. And then we have division, and then we have polarization. Now, how can this is from the general public, right? This is surveys of individuals to, across the country. Now, how does this look when we compare it to what's going on in Congress as a whole? So what we see here is a chart from Voteview, which is a website that has collected all of the votes of all members of Congress. This is House of Representatives and Senate since the beginning of time, since the beginning of the country, 1789, 1790, 1791, depending on the exact point. And what it shows is the major parties that have existed over time and how they're either close together or far apart. So what I'll do is I'll highlight a couple things here. First, I'm going to start in our modern times. So right around here, 1850, 1860. And you might be saying, why start here? It's because this was like the beginning of the modern two-party political system of Republicans and Democrats in the United States. We had some things going on before this time period, but we won't talk about those. We can talk about them in the discussion, or if you're a political science major, you will certainly learn about this in an upper division course on Congress or American political development / American political history. So what I like to point out here is that here's this line of red represents the Republican Party's median ideology. And I'm just going to kind of trace it a little bit to demonstrate that the ideology is kind of not really changed too much over time, but I want to highlight a couple of things. When the line is higher up, it's more conservative, and when it's lower, we'll say it's less conservative, so I'll put LC. And the same also holds true for the Democratic line as well. So here we see that there's some ideology kind of hanging out here, and then it gets closer together, or up, and goes down, 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 so it's down. So here, for example, we would say that there is a lot of liberal conservatives, but the Democratic Party is getting more liberal over time. So this is, I'll just use L's to demonstrate that the liberalness is getting more and more and more. So the size of the L's demonstrates that. Now, if you think about these lines as the top of a mountain, right? Imagine there's these two mountains moving, and right around here in 1930, 1940, 1950, they're pretty close together. And I'll use a black marker here to denote that. So from around here to here, they're pretty close together, right? The distance between these two, the median Republican and the median Democrat, isn't too far. But what we're seeing now, let's fast forward to 2018 data, maybe 2020 data. Like how far apart those two mountaintops are. The distance between the median is a heuristic or a shortcut in looking at how polarized these two parties are. So from the 1930s to the 1960s, their polarization was there, but it wasn't as intense, I would say, as it is today. It's almost double in difference between the median Democratic member and the median Republican member. So we have polarization, right? Both in the public's general sense and then in the congressional, right, the elected official sense. So I'm gonna go ahead and read this to you. So America's electorate is increasingly polarized along partisan lines about voting by mail during the COVID-19 crisis. So you may recall that sadly, the pandemic struck in March of 2020, which is a presidential election year. And every state had to decide, what are we going to do to make sure that people can participate politically in our system and how they can vote. So across the country, different states did different things. Most had vote by mail options. Many still required people to go to the polls, and it became contentious. It became a debate, like, why, some states were arguing that people shouldn't be allowed to vote by mail. They should have to go to a polling place. But obviously the concern at the time in November 2020 is that the COVID virus and its one of initial variants was rampant. And like, why expose people? Can't you just let them fill out a ballot at home and mail it in? And so this article goes on to describe how polarization existed even on a question of voting by mail. So this article asks, are voters as polarized as political leaders when it comes to their preferences about how to cast their ballots in November 2020 and their policy positions on how elections should be run in light of the COVID-19 outbreak? Prior research has shown little party divide on voting by mail, which means that both Democrats and Republican parties and people identify with those parties have been like, okay, voting by mail is cool, like it works. And in this case, with nearly equal percentages of voters in both parties choosing to vote this way were it an option. Has a divide opened up this year in how voters aligned with Democratic and Republican parties prefer to cast a ballot? ? The researchers addressed this question with two nationally diverse online surveys fielded from April 8th to April 10th and June 11th to June 13th with over 5,500 eligible voters. And they used an embedded experiment providing treated respondents with scientific projections about the COVID-19 outbreak. The researchers found that nearly 10 percentage point difference between Democrats and Republicans in their preference for voting by mail in April, which had doubled in size to nearly 20 points in June. This partisan gap is still wider for those exposed to scientific projections about the pandemic. These researchers also find support for national legislation requiring states to offer no excuse absentee ballots has emerged as an increasingly polarized issue. So think about that, right? When it came to voting and voting by mail, you had equal percentages in both the Democratic and Republican parties saying, okay, yeah, if I could vote by mail, I would vote by mail. I support that, right? But within the beginning of the pandemic and in April to June, which is less than 2 months, the attitudes about people towards voting by mail changed rather dramatically. So it was a 10-point difference between Democrats and Republicans for voting by mail in April, and then that doubled in less than 2 months, 60 days. So this study is fascinating because it illustrates on the most basic thing for accountability and democratic accountability in this country, there is a strong difference of opinion about using, in this case, a vote by mail democratic accountability mechanism as one option to engage in electoral accountability of elected officials. In other words, an issue that wasn't polarizing even maybe before 2020 became increasingly polarized and dramatically polarized in a very short period of time. And so when we think about democratic accountability, we ask ourselves, what does this mean? And from that survey, it shows us some line plots, and I'll just kind of point these out how to read it. So this was their April 2020 survey and their June 2020 survey. And the question they asked here is, in the upcoming November 3rd election, if you had the ability to cast a ballot in any way you wished, what would be your most preferred way to cast a ballot? And the different line breaks represent different parties. So solid line is Democrat, dotted line is Independent, and a dash dot represents Republican. And what we see here is that really isn't a difference in the control group, and there's a slight difference between Democrats and Independents saying they would like to vote by, they would like to cast a ballot, vote by mail, with a slightly lower percentage of Republicans. But you fast forward to June of 2020, we see that there's already a difference between Democrats, Independents, and Republicans in the control group, and then it's a slightly more dramatic in the treated group. The point is that with this example in this study, right, it begs the question, what are the implications of political polarization and division on our ability to hold our government accountable using electoral mechanisms if the very electoral mechanism, in this case voting by mail, is not in agreement with individuals from the two major parties in general. So with that, I'm gonna leave that question kind of hanging out there. I'll go ahead and stop the recording so we can have our discussion. But I appreciate you taking the time to listen in on this and connecting this concept of democratic accountability with political polarization, and kind of seeing where things go in this upcoming national election in November of 2022, and then the next presidential election in 2024. So with that, I want to thank you for taking the time, and have a good night.